When you think about large-scale industrial accidents, and let's be honest, who doesn't, you probably think about Chernobyl or perhaps an environmental disaster like the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. After all, those have both been in pop culture in the fairly recent past, with an HBO miniseries for one and a Hollywood movie starring that actor-rapper guy from New Kids on the Block for the other. But it's quite possible that you've never even heard of the worst industrial disaster in history, despite the fact that it killed nearly 4,000 people on the first day alone. Today we're going to take a look at the Bhopal Union Carbide disaster and see why it's worse than you ever could have imagined. In the late 1950s, Union Carbide Corporation invented a popular pesticide called Sevin and decided to develop their business in India. At the time, India was aggressively seeking international investment, so this led to a mutually beneficial business arrangement. Under the terms of the deal, the nation of India owned 22% of the Union Carbide India Limited subsidiary, which operated the factory in Bhopal. Indian investors and banking interests, both private and government-controlled, owned a total of 49.1% of the subsidiary, while Union Carbide owned the controlling 50.9% stake. When the factory deal was struck, India explicitly asked UCC to build in Bhopal, the capital city of the central Indian state of Madhya Pradesh. Seemed like a good idea at the time. Back in 1984, Bhopal had a population of over 900,000 citizens and spread over 110 square miles. So, to put that in perspective, that's around the size of the city of Orlando, with 3 times the population. But despite that density, the area was kind of diverse, offering a wide variety of both industrial and residential environments. Again, a bit like Orlando, but with less attractions. This isn't a random reference either. Bhopal had a little low-key tourism flow to it before the disaster. But while the area where UCC built its pesticide factory was convenient for transportation purposes, it was never zoned for hazardous materials. And in a far more serious oversight, it was surrounded on all sides by poor, densely packed neighborhoods. UCC initially intended to use the Bhopal plant to manufacture products that used methyl isocyanate, or MIC, which would have required using relatively small quantities of the deadly chemical. But over time, UCC consolidated a number of more hazardous complicated procedures into one factory, which massively increased the risk to the surrounding areas. The danger increased again when UCC made the decision to dismantle and move the Bhopal factory to another developing nation and began stripping it of key safety features and oversight.
Throughout the plant, the instruments were out of calibration because it saved money not to do the maintenance.
Add to that the fact that safety and regulatory standards at Union Carbide India were far more lax than those at its U.S. outpost in Institute, West Virginia. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Workers at the Bhopal plant knew something was wrong. Over a week before the deadly accident, employees began to notice issues around the factory. One of the MIC tanks refused to dispense the chemical regardless of how much nitrogen was pumped into it. This meant nitrogen was leaking from somewhere, but that didn't stop workers from washing one of the pipes with gushes of water. If you know anything about chemistry, water reacts immediately and violently with methyl isocyanate. One employee noticed that the pipe wasn't sealed properly, making this extremely hazardous.
But workers say that tank E610 was 75% full, way over the corporation's 50% recommendation.
Employees also noticed, but ignored, an abnormal increase in a pressure indicator for one of the storage tanks. Meanwhile, the MIC leak was gradually growing out of control.
All our fail-safes are compromised.
Speaking to the New York Times, one worker later recalled, "There was a tremendous sound, a messy boiling sound underneath the slab, like a cauldron." Workers watched helplessly as a white cloud of toxic gas spewed up through a massive crack in the concrete and began to drift toward the surrounding neighborhoods. Coverage of the Bhopal disaster after the fact revealed some of the most nightmarish safety lapses ever seen. The company offered extremely limited protections to its employees and didn't supply them with tools and information they needed to do their jobs safely. Shockingly, the overwhelming majority of employees had never read the safety guides that actually explained how to work with MIC, nor was the equipment up to par. According to one worker who spoke to the New York Times, instruments often didn't work, they got corroded, crystals would form on them.
Find a worker who hit the alarm, get rid of them.
Employees knew there was a gas leak only when their eyes began to water, leading one worker to declare, "We were human leak detectors." Obviously, that practice was a flagrant violation of standard operating procedures, but it was the norm in the Bhopal plant. This gave the workers very little response time. It also impaired their ability to find a leak if one occurred, as they would already be suffering from the early and deadly effects of MIC poisoning. In addition to underpreparing its workers, UCC failed to prepare the citizens of Bhopal for what to do in the event of a disaster. Tragically, neither the locals nor their doctors knew that the best protection against methyl isocyanates was a simple wet cloth over the face.
We had never heard the MIC methyl isocyanate, and we had no antidote or no such information from mineral carbide.
The factory had a comprehensive alarm system, but it went off so frequently that when it did go off again on December 3, 1984, nobody paid attention. It wouldn't have mattered anyway. The alarm was pretty quickly shut off. Many died in their sleep. Others were in agony.
Tens of thousands flee their homes in a panic stampede, choking to death as they run.
Immediate estimates placed the first day's death toll at just above 3,800, but the numbers continued to rise. According to a 2023 article in The Guardian, based on numbers of burial shrouds sold in the city, survivors make the conservative claim that about 8,000 people died in the first week alone, but the dying has never stopped.
So much suffering from India's invisible killer. At one point, an official said one death was being recorded every minute from the poison gas leak in the city of Bhopal.
We'll likely never know how many premature deaths occurred as a direct result of the Bhopal disaster. Tracking the long-term effects of the gas leak is difficult. At least 500,000 people were exposed to MIC, which can result in a catastrophic list of disorders. Again, that's half the population of the city exposed. What we do know is that many who survived did so with a vastly decreased quality of life. Victims as young as 2 years old developed chronic renal failure, locking them into a lifetime of dialysis after only moments of exposure. 40 years later, many of those victims still require daily medical visits in order to survive. In addition, large numbers of Bhopal citizens experienced permanent vision or respiratory issues. Babies were born with life-altering birth defects, and very little has been done to help them. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, Union Carbide tried everything they could to place the blame somewhere else. UCC Chairman Warren Anderson briefly pitched a baseless story about sabotage by an extremist group.
It doesn't sound like something that's inadvertent, and it could be a deliberate action.
His appalling deflection was almost immediately debunked. Union Carbide's major strategy was to point the finger at their Indian subsidiary for failing to maintain the plant. So U.S. lawyers dropped a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit on UCC's India branch. Then the Indian government passed the Bhopal Gas Leak Disaster Act of 1985, taking over legal representation of the victims. This kicked off a lengthy legal battle that ended up delivering shockingly small returns. In the end, UCC agreed to admit responsibility and pay the Indian government $470 million, which was then distributed to the victims, who received around $600 apiece for being poisoned. Now, that may sound like a lot of money for the corporation, but let's put things into perspective. If UCC had been held to the same standards as U.S. companies that mined asbestos, they would have been on the hook for more money than its $10 billion insurance plan was worth. That is a far cry from the $470 million they paid out. Reparations are important, but there was also enough criminal liability to go around in the Bhopal incident. Indian authorities initially sought to bring down the hammer on Chairman Warren Anderson, but they didn't bring him into custody. Instead, they allowed him to flee the country, after which the U.S. repeatedly refused to extradite him.
I am confident that the victims can be fairly and equitably compensated without a material adverse effect on the financial condition of Union Carbide Corporation.
Anderson died at the age of 92 in 2014 without ever facing justice. The only people criminally charged after the Bhopal disaster were 7 former senior executives of Union Carbide India Limited, all Indian men over the age of 70. They were convicted of death by negligence in 2010 and received India's maximum punishment for the charge, 2 years in prison and a 100,000 rupee fine, or just over $2,000 apiece.
Because they didn't spend a little bit of money and a little bit of time, thousands of people died.
Citizens took to the streets to protest the lenient sentences. Meanwhile, the convicted men went home on bail and began the appeal process. While the human cost of Bhopal was massive, the damage to the surrounding environment is on par with the worst toxic spills in history. The methyl isocyanate that leaked from the Bhopal factory will remain for generations to come. In 1999, tests of local wells and groundwater revealed tremendous concentrations of mercury and other carcinogenic chemicals. The potable water in the area consistently contains a variety of hazardous materials. By the way, do you know Bhopal's city nickname? The City of Lakes. Yeah. Further studies of Bhopal have revealed the presence of toxic chemicals and heavy metals such as lead in nearly everything, including soil, vegetation, and even breast milk. In a 2009 report for the Bhopal Medical Appeal, author Colin Toogood writes, "There are parts of the factory where the soil you walk on is 100% toxic waste." The cleanup of the chemical waste at the former Union Carbide plant has been slow-walked for 40 years. Union Carbide India Limited and its eventual new owners did some work to clean up the mess, but the Indian government eventually took over with their own slow-moving plan to dispose of the chemical waste. In 2001, Dow bought out UCC. On Dow's website, there's a dedicated page on which they make it clear that they had absolutely no involvement in, and therefore no responsibility for, the Bhopal tragedy. That while they are the exclusive owner of every commercial share of Union Carbide, they didn't inherit any of the company's liabilities.
The principle is clear that you cannot shed liability simply by selling your assets.
On its site, Dow also takes the opportunity to deflect blame onto the Indian branch of UCC, which no longer exists, as well as the Indian government. Meanwhile, the slow, painful process of cleaning up UCC's mess drags on. As of 2007, India announced its intent to bury or incinerate the hazardous material, but the actual process didn't get going until testing was done in 2015. By December 2024, India ordered the removal of 337 metric tons of toxic solid waste in 12 massive containers, driving them out of Bhopal and into a more industrial area for incineration in early 2025. If India had enforced stricter industrial regulations, refusing to allow foreign industries to uphold or even ignore safety standards, the incident may never have occurred. Unfortunately, 40 years later, India continues to be lenient with foreign corporations in pursuit of profit. The companies don't care, and the government doesn't care. But there were lessons taken to heart after Bhopal. In 1994, a decade after the disaster, DuPont wanted to build a nylon factory in Goa, with the stipulation that they'd be completely free from liability if the hazardous chemicals they were using created any issues. As a result of a powerful protest movement, which cost some activists their lives, the people of Goa fought off DuPont, forcing them to go elsewhere. The Indian government may not have learned from the mistakes that led to the Bhopal disaster, but the citizens remember.